Good afternoon. I'm Pastor Jack Price. This is our Bible study time. We are doing a series called Making Sense of Religion. We've spent 6 weeks looking at Christianity, its history, how it got to be the way it is. And most interesting, after especially the last 2 weeks, talking about the divisions, the splits that form Protestantism with the Reformation, then the Roman Catholic response of the Counter-Reformation. And last week about a lesser known branch of the Reformation called the Radical Reformation, which actually churches that I've been part of most of my life came out of that Radical Reformation, which one reformer called spiritual libertines, in which I think people took a little more flexibility and interpretation of the rules of church and certainly of the Bible. I happened to be hearing a podcast, an interview with a historian who's a specialist on the Reformation. And he did tell me that the story of Martin Luther tacking the 95 Theses to the Wittenberg Cathedral door, there is actually no proof that that ever happened. It's one of those legendary stories. I still haven't given up that it might have happened because it's very dramatic. But he said that probably if he had 95 Theses would have been written very small, and it would have all been written in Latin. And so most people probably would not have understood it anyway. So today we're going to move on. We've spent time, not exhaustively, but thoroughly with Christianity. Today we're going to start a multi-week series on Judaism. Its history, it has a long history, one of the oldest of our world religions, and also, it is still very much a part of our lives today. So today I'm going to be talking about biblical Judaism, the Judaism that we know of in the Bible that is shared by Jews and Christians. For Christians, the Old Testament and the New Testament, what Judaism looked like, how it functioned, where it came from at that point. And we'll just take a very brief glimpse of what happened post-biblical time. And then, next week we'll look at post-biblical Judaism a little more and see where we go from there. Okay? So Judaism is unique in that it's an ethnic group as well as a religious group. Biblical Judaism, we discover it right off the bat in the Bible. The fundamental tension, the fundamental tension described in biblical Judaism was that between being a peculiar people, called and set apart, separate from other people, a peculiar people, but also a people called to be a light to the nations, to all the nations. And those two missions of Judaism in the Bible live in a lot of conflict with each other, and we see that conflict lived out in the life of ancient Israel and New Testament Israel. One time when asked to give the essence of what Judaism was, a famous rabbi, Hillel, stated the following. He said, "What is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow man." Clearly, that is a version of what we would call the golden rule. What you would others to do to you, do that to them in the more positive sense. But still, that encapsulates the nature of Judaism, what it was, what it is, as well as Christianity. So Judaism in the Hebrew Bible, what we call our Old Testament, is what most Christians are more familiar with. Though we have to recognize that so much of modern Judaism that we know today, really developed after the biblical period. And but today, the biblical period. Judaism was named for Judah, who was one of the sons of Israel, or Jacob, one of the patriarchs. We're going to go back in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. The book of Genesis tells an awful lot of how many things came to be. The word Genesis means beginning, the generation or the generative dimension of life. In the beginning are the first words in English, and Genesis kind of means that. It's a long book, one of the longer books in the Bible. The first 11 chapters, or most of the 11th chapter as well, is what we would call a prehistoric period. This is a period that is not reflecting any of the historical periods with which scholars are familiar. In other words, all these stories take place prehistorically. Doesn't mean there were dinosaurs, because science does tell us that dinosaurs and human beings never coexisted at the same time, but prehistoric nonetheless. The first chapter of Genesis, and we're just going to use those chapter verse breakdowns because it's really convenient, even though they were not original and only developed much, much later. But the first chapter of Genesis and the beginning of chapter 2, the first 3.5 verses, was essentially a rewriting from a Hebrew perspective of the Babylonian creation story. In fact, this chapter, this account, this famous account, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, God said, let there be light, etc., probably was not written or written down until as late as the Babylonian captivity, and that would be in the 6th century BC or BCE. This Babylonian creation account was called the Enuma Elish. It is an account in which a god named Marduk attacked and killed his mother, Tiamat. Tiamat was the goddess of the sea, salt water. And Marduk was a god, all little g gods, of the air, storms and all of that. And so Marduk killed his mother Tiamat in order to become the chief of the gods. And so creation, the created order, came about through violence and domination. The violence of Tiamat, Marduk killing Tiamat, literally splitting her open, and in the splitting open of her body, the creation came about. The patterns of creation in the Genesis 1, that first chapter 1 story, actually follow the order of creation in the Enuma Elish. But the significant difference is, while in the Enuma Elish there is conflict and war and violence between the gods, in the Hebrew story of creation, God speaks creation into being. God said, let there be light. Okay, so that first chapter is really significant, but it shows us how this story can be borrowed from another and older culture, the Babylonian culture. The second chapter, third and fourth chapters tell the story of a different kind of creation, the Garden of Eden and life after Eden, east of Eden. Not to get into it real big now, but this story is probably older than the first chapter story. It shows God in an anthropomorphic fashion. God walks in the garden. God gets down on and forms man out of the dust of the earth, like making a sandcastle almost, breathes air, the air of life, into him. And so that anthropomorphic, human-like feature of God goes all the way through, and you have Adam and Eve, two people. In the first chapter, you have humanity being created when God says, let us bring forth mankind in our image. And this section of story also tells about Adam and Eve's descendants, their sons Cain and Abel. And then remember, Cain killed Abel because of jealousy over God liking Abel's gift, burnt offering, but not Cain's gift of a fruit offering or vegetable offering. And after after Abel was dead and Cain was exiled, Adam and Eve had another son, Seth, and so on and so forth. And then follows a multi-chapter story that includes the story of Noah and the ark. Again, this story is based on stories of other cultures like the Babylonians and characters who survived flood in an ark. But again, the Hebrew story specifically speaks to this one man, Noah's faithfulness, and the bringing onto the ark 2 by 2. And if you read carefully, there are some times in which the kosher, the clean animals, there were 7 of each of those, not just 2. And then at the very close of this section is the story of the Tower of Babel, probably from Babylon. And it's a story about how humanity was worshiping the gods in the heavens. And this tower was probably a worship tower designed to be able to look at the gods. It was a ziggurat, a tower for observing the movement of the stars, because it was believed that they were gods. They were not just inanimate heavenly beings. And following the Babel story, you have a listing of the descendants of Adam and Eve through Shem. Through Seth. And then you have the 3 sons of Noah and their wives. We never know the wives' names, but they were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And the descendants of Shem are the Shemites or the Semites. The Semitic people became the Jews and also the Arabs. And this is the story that the rest of Genesis tells. Beginning in the late part of chapter 11 and really chapter 12, it's no longer prehistoric or mythic story. It is now a saga, the saga of the patriarchs and the matriarchs, Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Rachel. I'll get all those straight now. And Jacob's name was changed to Israel. And so thereafter, his descendants were the children of Israel. These stories took place probably in a clear historic setting, not prehistoric, probably somewhere between 2000 or maybe 1800 BC and about 15 or 1400 BC. There was a covenant with Abraham and God. There were 12 tribes of Israel based on the 12 sons of Jacob, with some moving around. There was the story of the sojourn of the patriarchs into Egypt and then into the land of Goshen with Joseph. Slavery in Egypt for over 400 years. And finally, the story of the Exodus from Egypt led by Moses, who was a descendant of one of Abraham's sons or Jacob's sons. The Exodus in Egypt led by Moses was maybe the seminal event in Jewish history, certainly one of the primary ones. It was the beginning event, because with the Exodus you had the development of the people of Israel. And so there is, I have to say, no clear historical record outside the Bible of all these events. How the Israelites left Egyptian slavery, Pharaoh killed in the Red Sea, the Israelites receiving the law, the promised land, that situation, all the story of Joshua and the judges, the conquest of the promised land. All of these things we know about from the Bible. There's no extra biblical record of them. It doesn't mean they're not true, but it's just one of those things that as scholars research all these things, there are some things that just have no historical record outside this book of faith. Joshua and the story of the promised land, the conquest of the promised land, is really a story about holy war as the will of God. That's hard for us modern believers to follow, but and to swallow. But that is essentially what that book is about. But following Joshua, you have a period of the judges, and judges were charismatic figures who kind of rose to leadership in times of national crisis and for the people of Israel. And what happened was, once the crisis was resolved, after a period of time with that judge leading Israel, when the judge would die, there was another period of upheaval that led to crisis, and a new judge that came. All of this is told then in the book of Judges and part of Samuel. And then comes the time of the monarchy. And the monarchy with King Saul being the first king of Israel, though Israel was still not really a united kingdom at that point. But then there was King David, and David and his son, King Solomon, represented the first fully realized kingdom of Israel. David had been a charismatic leader, and he was a charismatic king. And under him, Israel reached its boundaries, its full boundaries with the tribes, and at least a semblance of power. They were a nation on the national stage. Again, I'll say outside the Bible, there was no historic record of King David or King Solomon. Again, don't tell people in Israel that, because they have King David Boulevard and King Solomon Boulevard. These are such vital people in the lives of Israel. Let me just say a word from David's kingship. That was a good rule of thumb, is to think David became king somewhere around the year 1000 BC. Maybe a little later, but say around then. And he reigned for about 40 years. And then Solomon, his son, who was a second son of David's from Bathsheba. And boy, that was quite a story. And the first son from that illicit relationship died. Then, anyway, David and Bathsheba were married, and their son Solomon became the successor to King David. And then, after King Solomon died, and under Solomon, Israel was quite wealthy, but they also became a nation much like many other nations. Solomon made many of his people, forced them to labor to build the temple, his new palace, and all those things. They taxed them unmercifully, and it was not the happiest time. And Solomon had not only many wives and concubines, but many foreign wives. And this led to a lot of trouble. And eventually, when Solomon died, people were ready for a change. He died after reigning about 40 years, so at about 920 BC. And probably unwise politics led his son, who was Rehoboam, I think that's right. I don't have it in my notes, but he was going to become a king just like his father Solomon, when some of his advisors said this would be a great time to tell the people, you're going to be a little kinder and gentler, you're not going to force them labor, you're going to improve the quality of their lives. Other advisors told Rehoboam, no, you need to bear down even harder, or you don't want to lose control. So Rehoboam decided he was going to bear down harder. However much his father had abused the people, he was going to do it even more. And that led to a rebellion and a split. And General Jeroboam, who had been Solomon's general, became the leader of the 10 tribes that split away from Solomon's kingdom. Now, there were only 12 to begin with, so most of the people left. Most of the kingdom left. And this new kingdom of the 10 tribes actually called themselves Israel. And their capital was up in Shechem, and eventually the capital was called Samaria. Rehoboam's kingdom became known as Judah because the 2 tribes were Judah and most of Benjamin. And so that one thing they still had was they had Jerusalem and they had the temple there. And so the northern kingdom under Jeroboam split away and became its own kingdom, and the southern kingdom of Judah was continued the tradition of the temple, and really the tradition that was the Davidic line, and the line that would give birth, if you will, to the Messiah idea. Okay, so not too much longer. I think it was, let's see, 920, about 200 years or so after the death of Solomon, the kingdom of Israel, that northern kingdom of 10 tribes, was conquered and exiled by the empire of Assyria. And Assyria is a powerful empire in the area. And they not only sent them into exile, they really destroyed Israel. And you've heard of the myths about the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Well, those were those tribes, and this was the event, the exile that led to the destruction of the kingdom of Israel. And this happened about the same time in the north, while a young prophet named Isaiah was living in the south. So, about 150 years after the exile and destruction of Israel by the Assyrian Empire, and Assyria also threatened Jerusalem but did not conquer them, Jerusalem and Judah were themselves conquered by the empire that had conquered Assyria, and that was Babylon. The Babylonian Empire destroyed the Temple of Solomon and Jerusalem, and took all the leaders into exile in Babylon and destroyed so many people. And so that happened about 587, 586 BC, and they were in exile for 70 years, something like that. During that time of exile, the story just goes on, doesn't it? But it's so important to what Israel became. During that time of exile in Babylon, the Persian Empire, the Medes and the Persians, grew in strength, and they conquered Babylon while the Jewish people were still there. And in fact, what's interesting is that the stories of Daniel and Daniel's friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were set during this time of Babylonian exile and then of the Persian conquest. Even though they were written much later, this is the time of their setting. So, after the Medes and Persians conquered Babylon, Cyrus, I think, was the king. And he decreed that all these slave people should go home. This was politically expedient because it was expensive to maintain them there, to house them, to feed them, even if they were slave labor. So if they went back to their own place, they would be grateful to the Medes and Persians, but they would also have to send taxes or tributes back. So it was a smart thing to do, and Cyrus did that. And the first diaspora, the first return to Jews to Israel was in about 539 BC or so. And only about 10% of the Jewish people went back to Jerusalem. And the ones that went back found that things were a mess, and the people had moved in there in the meantime, were not happy to see these Jewish people come back. There eventually was a little more work done, more people came, Ezra and Nehemiah oversaw the efforts to begin to build a second temple, to begin to rebuild Jerusalem. All this happened. The second temple was finished in 516 BC. For some 200 years, the nation of Judah was a vassal of the Persian Empire. And then a Macedonian Greek by the name of Alexander the Great came and conquered the whole former Persian Empire in about 331 BC. During this period that the Jewish people were now subjugated under Alexander and the Greeks, many things happened. A translation of Hebrew scripture into Greek was done in the Egyptian city of Alexandria, and this translation was called the Septuagint. And it was the first time that the Torah particularly had been translated out of Hebrew. For a long time, it was hardly written down except just with the consonants, no vowels, so that those who knew what the words were could still control the message and the meaning. After Alexander died, there was fighting over who and how they would divide the kingdom. And his kingdom was divided into 4 units with 4 of his generals taking command. The area of Palestine and Egypt was ruled by the Ptolemies. It has a silent P at the beginning, but the Ptolemies ruled, and then other generals ruled in other areas, like the Seleucids in Syria. And after some period of time, Judah became subjugated under the Seleucids rather than the Ptolemies. And this led to events in Judah that led to rebellion, because the last of these Seleucid kings was Antiochus Epiphanes, and he was bound and determined to make the Jewish people give up their peculiar habits, their kosher habits, their religious habits, and become Greek in his sense. And so he persecuted them, and this led to a rebellion called the Maccabean Rebellion, because the family that was called Hasmoneans, that was their name, they were called the Maccabeans because that means the lion. And they led, especially Judas, led this rebellion and won throughout the Seleucids, the Syrians, and for a period of time, there was a free Jewish state. It was precarious, but it was free. And in about 160 BC was the establishment of the festival called Hanukkah to celebrate the Maccabean Rebellion, and ostensibly based on this miracle of oil that lasted for 8 days in the temple. Finally, though, in about 64, 63 BC, Judah was itself conquered again by the Empire of Rome. And just like Alexander had come through, Rome came through that whole area and conquered so many areas. And they set up a king named Herod the Great, in 43 BC, and he reigned for some 40 years until his death in 4 BC. Now, this was not good, but there were some good things. He expanded the Second Temple greatly using Roman money. He made it far larger and grander than Solomon's temple had been. And this was the temple and the Herod that were likely around when Jesus was born, and the temple that became one of the wonders of the ancient world. Real quickly, because I've talked a while, but just want to let you know that the themes in the Bible are the themes of monarchy and exile and post-exilic periods. You have Judaism, the Exodus, the wilderness, the promised land, the collective memory of a relived past. You have liberation through the Exodus, liberation from Egypt. That's relived each year at the Passover festival. You also have tradition. The souls of all Jews were ostensibly present at Mount Sinai with Moses. And you have festivals that commemorate those things. I'm going to continue with this next week as we move into post-biblical Judaism, New Testament and post-biblical Judaism. But I think that's enough for today. So thank you so much. God bless, and you take care.